In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to apply a bump map and then how to edit that bump map using the Shading Effects editor. And a bump map is an image that we're using to create a texture, or a surface texture we should really say, on the actual effect that we've got. So let's create an effect. First thing we'll do is we'll type in a character or a letter. A letter A will do. Make that a bit larger so we can see what we're doing. And we're going to come down here and we're going to click on the Special Effects and Shading flyout. I'm going to go down here and click on Bumps. So by clicking on this, that gives us some bumps onto the surface of this particular effect we've got. And this is just a generic set of bumps that we're using. Now, to edit these bumps, we can come up to the Effects menu and we can click on the Shading tools here, which brings up the Shading Effects editor, or we can go down to this flyout and click on the Shading tools here, or alternatively we can click on this button here to bring up the Shading tools. And as always in VinylMaster, you get the second row of tools which are context sensitive based on what we've got on the drawing area and what we've got selected in the mode we're currently in. So that's why we can see them here. So I can click on the shading tools here and we'll see this is the actual bump map that or the image we're using to create these bumps. So if I move this out the way here, or up in the corner here, you can see that this polka dot effect is repeating continuously over this effect, and we can see how this image is actually being turned into a bump map. Now, what I will do in this case is I'll bring up a more probably relevant bump map for this particular example I want to make. So I'll click on the presets, and we've got these wrought iron effects as you can see here. Now I'll choose, blue will be okay, I'll make it blue, and I'll move it over here and I'll zoom in a little bit more just so you can see what's actually going on. And you can see that this image we're using of this rusty panel at this tile size, this bump height and this smoothing level is giving us this wrought iron effect, and it's an actual 3D texture that's been created on this particular effect. So we can now edit this, and we don't have to use this texture, it's just this texture happens to make this effect, and I can show you the difference. If I say select this texture, I get that effect. If I selected, say, this texture, I then get this effect, which is totally different to what the current other one was. So, and again, this particular effect you can see here is making a completely different look. But we'll go back to what we had, which was this rusty old panel here. Now the tile size, it's a little bit like a zoom tool. If I make that 5%, you can see I get this repetitive thing going on here because I've sort of zoomed out. Now if I zoom back in or set the tile size to 100%, that's a one-to-one mapping, and we can see that that's what we get there. If I make it 200%, it's quite different again. So what effect you get will greatly be influenced on the tile size you set. So at 100%, that's the effect we get. The bump height itself is how pronounced the actual bump looks. So if I make that, say, at 1, you can see here it's quite shallow, it's not that pronounced. If I turn that to, say, 10, it's very pronounced now, and the higher you go, we go to 20, it gets the law of diminishing returns to where you actually don't get much effect. So in this particular case you'll find that around about 15 is about as high as it will actually look, and you can see there's very little effect now. So I'll set that back to 10. And smoothing sets out I can show you, I'll set smoothing so much higher, and you can see it's too high there. I'll bring that right down, and this is where you can start to see the effect of smoothing. So at 10% you can see that that's quite smooth, and if I set that to, say, 15%, it's really smoothing out the bumps, and at 20% they start to almost disappear. Now the advantage of smoothing is if you just want to have a very subtle effect, you know, where it's just making an influence on the object, like in this case here, I'll just zoom back out to that, slide that across. It's very subtle, this bump. Now if I make the smoothing, say, 33%, it becomes more and more subtle to the stage of it almost vanishing. Then if I go to, say, 23%, you can start to see it coming in. So if you combine this with a reflection, you can have it looking, or you can make all manner of effects and different sorts of looks. And you can see how the smoothing is actually affecting this highlight here. If I make that smoothing, say, 50%, You can see how it affects it there, down to say 5%. So smoothing, bump height and tile size, each one of these individually actually has quite an effect on the bump or the bump map and the effect of the actual object you actually end up with, as does the texture itself. So, depending on what you select, you can get a very, very different look. There's an example. These flowers at that bump height and that smoothing have quite an effect on this job. And if I make the tile size say 25%, you can see how they become much smaller, and if I zoom in, we're getting these sorts of effects. So as I've mentioned in other lessons with this particular tool, the Shading Effects Editor, what you select as far as a texture goes, and these tools here greatly and significantly influence the result you get, and you should experiment. If you've got a job that you're trying to get a particular look with, try different textures. See what the effects are and how adjusting these effects greatly influence what you get. And that's why we say there's an infinite range of effects you can create, because when you combine a texture with a tile size, and then you change its bump height, and then you affect its smoothing, apply a reflection, fiddle around with things like the bevels, you can get completely different looks with your artwork. So experimentation is key, but you can see here bumps are applied in this tab, and by checking this, if I uncheck it, the bumps are removed. And I'm just left with that reflection map. If I check that back on, the bumps come back. And that's the end of this lesson.